Hi, I'm Wayne Brittenden for the Political Compass podcasts. Anthems, patriotic and nationalistic songs. Songs that make jaws jut out and even the hairs on arms stand to attention. Music's been an important tool in generating national pride, patriotism, the sense of belonging that may inspire acts of great heroism, or as Bertrand Russell complained, a willingness to kill or be killed for trivial reasons. Before the 1500s in Europe, the nation-state as we know it now didn't really exist. People identified themselves with a region. Rulers of states didn't have great control. That was in the hands of local feudal lords. It wasn't until the 19th century that the real nation-state emerged, with monarchs encouraging their subjects to feel loyalty towards them. Music played a potent part in drumming up nationalist sentiments, and no one knows more about that than Erik Levi, Professor of Music at London's Royal Holloway University. He's written widely on the subject, including a groundbreaking book, Music in the Third Reich. So, Erik, welcome to the Political Compass podcasts.
Thank you.
Now, I began in introducing you by talking about regional pride as well as national pride because the nation state has been a comparatively recent thing. And I just wondered if there were regional songs. I mean, I'm thinking, was there a Bavaria the Beautiful or Prussia the Perfect?
There were regional songs because, particularly in Germany, and regional rivalries continued once those countries were unified. The rivalries between Munich, which was the capital of Bavaria, and Berlin, and particularly for the Nazis, of course, whose movement really originated in Munich. So there was always that kind of rivalry there, and so there was a definite emphasis on specific types of folk music. I mean, in concert music of the time, for example, we're talking about the 30s here, a composer like Carl Orff stressed how much he owed to Bavarian folk music, and indeed, in his most famous piece, Carmine Burana, he writes there's one instrumental movement which is a Bavarian folk dance.
So Karl Orff was actually a fellow traveller, wasn't he? He was quite sympathetic to the Reich.
Well, it's a very complicated question. We're talking about some people who were basically remaining in Germany, but of course he had a proportion of Jewish blood as well. So he could have been. It could have been difficult if they'd bothered to research his genealogical origins.
Yes, of course. And I wonder, just generally, if you could tell us a little more about your research, because I know you've concentrated a lot on the 20th century and those awful times.
Yes.
Could you give us some more insights in how an authoritarian regime uses music for its own benefit?
Well, I think the reason why I was interested, well, first of all, I started my research about 30 years ago. And the reason I focused on Nazi Germany is partly, of course, my background, because I'm the son of refugees, but also because a veil of silence was effectively drawn over musical life in Germany after the war. Because, as you know, there were various people who were implicated in running musical organizations during the Nazi period who, by force of circumstance, managed to continue to operate in the post-war period, not only in West Germany, but in East Germany, the former East Germany. And so, therefore, there was a kind of a veil of silence over what some people had done. So I wanted to break that silence. And, of course, eventually those people died. So one could kind of exhume the past much more effectively. So that was my interest in it. I mean, at the moment, my last book was an edited volume on how the Germans imposed their musical imperialism on the territories they occupied during the Second World War. And I'm still going on with that because I'm now involved with a very big European project on the reception of Beethoven's music and how Beethoven was used both by the Nazis as a sort of symbol of German nationalism, and by the resistance as a symbol of liberation.
So how were the German songs effective? Are you saying that the locals that were the victims of Nazism was sort of swayed by the music?
Well, music was a very powerful vehicle, as you can imagine, both serious music and folk music as a way of drumming up support. And you mentioned that amazing moment in Cabaret, which, well, when I say amazing, chilling moment, well, I think that there was a great emphasis on songbooks. I mean, if you go into a library and order up, look at what was published at the time, between 1933 and 1945, you'll be amazed at the number of songbooks that were issued. Because it was encouraged, the Hitler Youth were encouraged to participate in musical events, and singing was a way of bonding people together. And so they adapted many very famous, tried and tested songs that had been sung, for generations. They adapted the words and adapted them to the contemporary circumstance. And those remained popular until up to the in the post-war period as well. Some of them.
Perhaps I should clarify that reference to the film Cabaret. It relates, of course, to an earlier conversation we had. I mentioned to you that it was the most chilling moment I'd ever seen in a film, where a young Nazi youth stands up and beautifully sings "Tomorrow Belongs to Me." And the thing that really shocked me was that many people in the audience that I saw that with in Britain, I knew quite a number of people at the theatre, and they said they were actually moved by the song, even though they knew its really ugly implications. Yeah.
Well, it just shows you the power of music. It has a subliminal power, doesn't it? And if the melody is sufficiently catching, and the words and it's this fusion of words and melody, which it's almost impossible to get it sometimes. So, I mean, a lot of songwriters try to create this, but obviously in that particular case and in others, the fusion of words and music just produces this moving effect, which really, has to quote a very old beer advert, reaches the parts other bits don't reach. So that's why people were kind of moved by it. You see what I mean?
Right. Maybe it was something to do with the beer in that beer hall.
No, well, I mean, obviously alcohol does fuse. I mean, if you think about going to a football match, where people sing along, they're often inebriated. So I suppose that kind of impact, obviously, it intensifies. It's a rush of blood, as it were.
Right. Well, undoubtedly, sober Britain was swept up with God Save the King when it was written in 1745.
That's
but
right,
I wonder if they really heard some of the words. I mean, verse 2: "Scatter our enemies and make them fall. Confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks." Not very, very fine sentiments.
Not at all. But then if you think about the last night of the proms and the Royal Britannia...
The music hooligans.
Yeah, well, exactly. But, I mean, people... you might say that words, they're out of date now, but they have a certain sinister undertone, of course.
Right, right. Well, I might add with God Save the King, I did read that verse 3 was added sometime later, that men should be brothers and form one family. And that, I don't know when that was written, but I hope for the sake of credibility it was after slavery was abolished.
Well, yes. Well, of course, there's quite a lot of trying to correct past errors now. Some people call it wokeism, but I don't know what
Yeah.
But interesting.
Indeed. Now, getting back to anthems and patriotic music, is there any distinction between nationalism and patriotism where music's concerned?
Oh, wow. You're asking a really complicated question there. Not sure whether I can answer that directly. I mean, we're talking about songs here, and national songs rather than patriotic songs. I'm not quite sure how I'd categorize the difference between the two. I haven't really, to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't like to come up with a clear distinction necessarily.
Right. A national anthem loses some of its its power, doesn't it, when it's sung by an individual, however well he's singing, en masse, everyone in their own key. Still, it has a more still has a more rousing effect. So
it does.
It seems to me that if they want to convey that unity and strength, they have to be singing it en masse, and it has to be not a very complex composition.
Well, it can't be too complex, and actually, it's very interesting watching. I don't know whether you watched the World Cup, but you got a flavour of the different anthems, and some of the anthems I thought were quite complicated compared to others. But there again, if you think of the Marseillaise, for example, it's such a fantastic piece. It really is a marvellous piece. And, of course, Berlioz did a wonderful orchestral and choral arrangement, which is absolutely stirring. And it's actually a very good piece of music. But it also, what you're talking about there is the fact that it has a climactic points where it rises in intensity, and I think that's part of its strength. Whereas I don't think that happens with, I think God Save the Queen, I hope I'm not going to be, or God Save the King as well, I should say now, is a bit of a dreary melody, I must say. I mean, Land of Hope and Glory is much more powerful, I think. And perhaps even more powerful than that is the middle section, Jupiter from the whole planets, which is sung by rugby people, of course, that you probably know.
And then the Ecuadorian national anthem sounds more like a piece of opera.
It does. Well, that actually tells you something about the occupiers. It suggests that the people who created these states. I mean, this is true, of course, of South America. We've discovered in concert music quite a lot of very interesting Baroque music, which was written by people who settled in these Spanish and Portuguese occupied countries at that time, writing in the styles of the Western, French, German, Italian Baroque traditions. So that's not surprising, but you're right. It is rather surprising that it's so operatic.
Yes. So, have anthems lost some of their potency now in the age of globalization and the World Wide Web?
I would have thought that a lot of things have lost their potency because everything is available at the flick of a switch. And so, I mean, the fact that you can now watch rather than participate live. I mean, something live is it's completely different. The kind of frenzy of being in a stadium and being surrounded by cheering fans, as it were, compared to watching it on television, which you can do instantly, must dilute the experience, I would think.
It does. Definitely. It does. But nevertheless, it seems that a badge of achieving true nationhood is having your own song.
Absolutely, yes. And it's interesting, for instance, with if you look at Russia, for example, that they preserved the Soviet national anthem. That they haven't changed it since they're now the Russian Federation, whatever they're called. But it's still the same song. There was a competition. I don't know whether you know this. There was a competition to write a national anthem for in 1940, I think. And I think as famous people like Shostakovich and Khachaturian were invited to submit their they were obviously given quite a lot of financial incentive to come up with a good tune, but it was somebody called Alexandrov, I think, who composed that Russian or Soviet anthem, and it's a wonderful anthem. And again, I think one thing he was asking me about was what musical qualities should it have. I think one thing that particular anthem has, and which it shares with the Marseillaise, is it grows in intensity. And I think that may be also true of the song from the cabaret. It starts sort of plainly, but then it whips you up into a kind of frenzy of,
it's a kind of
emotion.
A kind of crescendo, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But there is an interesting one. You were also talking about the Internationale.
We're celebrating an idea rather than a nation.
Yes, so but also fighting for a political cause. One very famous example, which if you've got time to illustrate, is the Solidarity song by Hans Eisler, which was a kind of left-wing song. It was composed in the early 1930s and featured in a very famous film, which he and Bertolt Brecht collaborated, called Kuhle Wampe. It was about a deprived housing estate in Berlin. There, what he does, which is very clever, it's a fantastically sort of memorable piece of writing. But what it does is, because it's about a struggle, it's about the workers' struggle, it never resolves. It doesn't resolve on a clear key. It hangs in the balance, because we're still in this. The whole point is that we're still involved in this struggle.
Yes, but interestingly, that amazing film, at the end, in the conversation on the bus with his fellow passengers, the character on the bus anticipates a neoliberal globalized world.
Yes, that's interesting. Yes, absolutely amazing. Yes.
So, I mean, Eisler and these people understood the nature of the authoritarian personality, an important aspect in our political compass. But surprising to me is post-World War II, if you look at the Frankfurt School of people like Adorno. And Reich and Erich Fromm, these people had very little to say about the power of music, and yet they went very deeply into the authoritarian personality and the motivations.
Yeah, I think maybe they were fixated on, which is interesting with Adorno, because he knew Eisler very well, and he even collaborated with him on a book composing for the films. So it is curious. But I wonder whether they were so fixated on concert music that they, or at least in Adorno's case, that he didn't bother too much with what we might call popular music, or Unterhaltungsmusik, or folk music. Yeah. Maybe it's just a focus rather than. It is strange. You're right, but isn't that also? But maybe that is part of the focus in the 50s and 60s from the avant-garde, that they basically wanted to wipe away everything that had gone before, and this idea that Adorno said, there can't be any poetry after Auschwitz. And so, therefore, this sort of focus by younger composers at that time on purely abstract sound with no connotations is a kind of reaction to the way that they felt music had been vandalized in the past.
Didn't Goebbels tinker with Western popular music, particularly American popular music, swing, and change the lyrics for his own purposes?
I don't know whether Goebbels himself did, but they certainly. What the big problem for the Germans was the popularity of jazz, and particularly, if I may use Afro-American jazz in Germany, and the idea of banning it outright would not have worked. So they had to kind of come up with a compromise or a sanitized version of the music, because popular music continued in Germany. There were sort of very learned professors who tried to argue that syncopation was degenerate and things like that, but it just didn't make much sense. They also said instruments like the saxophone shouldn't be used and things like really ridiculous.
What do they have against the saxophone?
Well, I suppose it's got. I mean, I don't know whether you know about the Degenerate Music exhibition. The cover of the booklet which accompanied the exhibition, which is a scurrilous piece of writing, has a picture of a Afro-American, very heavily, sort of very thick lips, playing a saxophone with the Star of David above it. It's a very potent sort of symbol.
Now, some of our listeners might ask, why were the Nazis so preoccupied with art, with music? And it seems to me pretty easy to understand, because fascism by its very nature is against differences. It wants conformity, it wants predictability, and everything understandable and in its right place. And then something comes along like cubism, abstract art, or atonal music, and it's completely beyond their comprehension. And rather than celebrating the diversity, like all good fascists, they're actually threatened by it.
Indeed. But, of course, there is a difference between Italian fascism and German fascism, because, at least for a time in Italy, modernism flourished, of course, under Mussolini. I mean, it was possible to play atonal music and have it even supported by the regime. So there are differences.
So how did Mussolini change? I mean, he became...
Well, he changed partly because he became closer to Hitler. I mean, this happened in 1938 when they signed a pact, a cultural pact. And then they started to go against the modernists. Not only were Jews removed, but also the composers who were the leaders of the avant-garde they modified their musical language to accord with the situation at that time.
So, Erik, let's suppose that a new country comes along and they come to you and say, we need a national song. What are you going to be looking for in your composition? What's going to make a good and effective national song?
Well, first of all, I suppose the words can't be too banal. I mean, they've got to be it's difficult to know. And you can't obviously... Maybe you'd have to find a poem that is already in the kind of heritage of that country that has particular resonances. But then I think the obvious quality has to be a memorable melody, or a melody that is sufficiently strong not to be banal. I know that sounds difficult, but it's obviously possible.
There are a hell of a lot of national songs that are dripping with banality.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly.
So your one's going to...
I don't know what the New Zealand anthem is, actually.
Well, I'll tell you about the New Zealand anthem, as I understand it. It's the only one in the world that mentions love. And
really?
God of nations at thy feet, in the bonds of love we meet. And one of the verses pleads God to keep the country free of corrupt government. So it is a rather different proposition. In fact, a musicologist in Norway included that perspective on the New Zealand national song in a musical encyclopedia that he produced. So I don't even think many New Zealanders know about the full extent of the vision that was in the New Zealand piece.
There is also interesting stuff about, discussions about, I've read in the post-war period about what we do with the German anthem and the Austrian anthem, and I mean, that's got such a good melody because it's Haydn. Da 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 dee da 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 da. And that's such a good tune, you know.
I know.
But then the words are a bit suspect.
I know. Well, Erik, you haven't finished your assignment yet. You've got to finish your anthem, and you've talked about the lyrics, but we want to hear what musical devices you're going to deploy.
Well, I think a certain degree of repetition and also building up to a sort of fervent climax, perhaps with something that you can repeat, a kind of refrain, which then hammers home, if I may use that term, which is a Goebbels term, hammers home the message.
Okay, we'll be looking forward to that one. Can we talk about a few national anthems? You've mentioned the French one and you've mentioned the Russian one.
Yeah.
What national anthem strikes you as being particularly poor?
Well, I don't like them. I'm going to be off with his head, but I don't. I find the British national anthem pretty dreary.
Yeah.
I think it's a very dull melody. But then, I don't know whether you ever heard the arrangement by Benjamin Britten. What is very inspiring about that is that he starts off very quietly with sort of hints of the melody, and then what he does, which is exactly what I said before, is he changes key, and the whole choir and orchestra come together in a change of key, and it's quite exciting what he does. It's quite imaginative.
Yeah. But that's not going to be a sing-along, is it?
Well, I think the implication is perhaps that when it starts quietly, you don't sing along because it's so quiet and sort of withdrawn. And then as it changes key, there's sort of rush of blood. It's a very clever sort of manipulation of emotion, and then I think you would expect people to probably join in. A bit like a hymn, you know.
Interesting how Jerusalem has become a public school standard, and it's considered a tool of the establishment, which is what its writer Blake didn't have in mind at all.
No, well, that's interesting how pieces or texts or music can become something different according to the generation.
Some of the owners of those dark satanic mills would have had their kids in the schools.
Exactly. God, yes, you're right. Absolutely. It's but that again illustrates the power of the music. It's quite a stirring. It's very cleverly constructed, that melody. One of my colleagues did a brilliant lecture on it. This is a guy called David Owen Norris, who talks about how brilliantly Parry constructed that piece, what he does, what decisions he made, which make it such a strong and moving piece of music.
Good. Well, Erik, we're just about run out of time. It's going to go down really well with our listeners, and thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll stay in touch. And please let us know when you've completed your anthem.
Well, I need some financial incentive.
Okay. Cheers.
Okay.
Bye.
All the best. Cheers. Bye.